Well, we've synthesized 7 evaluations, and there's a number of lessons that come out from them. I think the first is simply that budget support can work, and that it can work in a set of really quite diverse circumstances, and a set of circumstances that are not really very favorable. So each of the countries, yes, I would say each of the 7 countries had some kind of a governance problem, some of them more severe than others. Most of them had issues of effectiveness of government, and yet despite that they were able to achieve significant results in the area of service delivery and in the area of reform. And I think that's a very important lesson, that even in a difficult setting one can get certain results which will be sustained. And that, I think, is the fundamental. At the same time, the type of results that we got were not really the full set of results that we could have got. So I think the second lesson is that budget support has a good deal more potential. In the areas where there was agreement about which types of policies should be put in place and how they should be scaled up, so for example in health, in education, in the road sector in some countries, and in countries such as South Africa's other sectors too, such as the justice sector, where there was agreement between the development partners and the government about how to proceed, and where there was a process in place for getting things done, good progress was made. But there's other sectors, such as the agriculture sector, the infrastructure sector, energy, sectors more closely linked to growth and poverty reduction, where there was much less progress. And the finding across the evaluations is that the reason for the lack of progress was because the policy dialogue largely broke down. And there was too much focus of policy dialogue, if you like, on negative things, on corruption scandals and how they were being addressed, on aspects of the debate where progress wasn't being made, rather than thinking in a constructive way about how to make progress in these core areas related to poverty reduction. And why didn't we make progress? Because trust was lost in many cases. And trust was lost partly because of the reaction to the corruption scandals and because of the sudden suspension of budget support in some cases. And also because from the very beginning there was an awkward balancing of a dialogue process which required the development agencies to monitor whether disbursement conditions had been fulfilled, and in the same forum to try and have a constructive discussion about how to reduce poverty or solve the energy crisis. And clearly those two need to be separated. So that was another significant lesson. The other lesson, which is related, is that if you do want to have a strategic forward-looking dialogue, that has to be part of the process from the very beginning. One can't start off with some half-baked matrix of reforms and think that you're going to have a strategic discussion. One needs to think from the very beginning, we're here to work with this government to solve serious problems, and therefore what do we need to do? And you back your dialogue up with some research, you focus on the areas that are important, and you keep the focus narrow. So taking deliberate measures to promote strategic forward-thinking dialogue is I think, the second lesson. The third lesson, which we've heard before, is simply that money doesn't buy reform. That in several of these countries where there was a standoff between the development partners and the government, and there were suspensions of budget support or reductions in the release of variable tranches, even in those cases, that did not generate change. And yet, by contrast, in the middle-income countries where the budget support financial weight was not very high, we found areas where dialogue and technical assistance was able to help to get policy reform. So it doesn't relate directly to the money, although the money is important. And I think those are the key lessons. Well, our recommendations try to build on the lessons. So we do believe it's important, firstly, to recognize that budget support is working in a range of settings and that it is a useful development modality. Not everywhere, not always, but in more settings than perhaps one might imagine. And that the skepticism over budget support, which prevails in the political and I would say in the media milieu in Europe, is not justified. That, I think, is a message that needs to be put out. And at the same time, there will be skeptical reactions, and there needs to be a debate. There will be people who will challenge each of these evaluations and who will challenge the synthesis, and there has to be a debate. So the first process, the first recommendation is to get this out in the open, to have a debate. The second is to go back to the origins of budget support and remember that this was about a partnership. It was about working with governments to address issues of poverty reduction, to improve social service delivery, putting the accent on partnership and therefore on trust. To a degree, that partnership has been lost in many countries, and one needs to renew it. The development agencies need to step back and say, where we do this, we will do it in a serious way on a partnership basis. If that is to work, the next recommendation is really about management processes and design processes. Part of the reason why development agencies have sometimes suspended budget support is because they were getting into situations that they had not fully appreciated. All of these developing countries have problems with governance. They will have frauds. They will have corruption scandals. The question is, are those corruption scandals being identified? Is corrective action being taken? Is there a public debate about it? So long as those things happen, one should not stop budget support because of the scandal itself. Just as in Europe, we wouldn't stop financing our police services because there is a scandal in the police sector. And that means then that if one is going to be prepared for scandals, one needs to know in advance that they will happen. That means there needs to be a better contextual analysis of which governments we can work with, which ones we can't. And linked to that, a sense of where the risks are coming and how we can mitigate against them. If there is a particular sector that has had repeated procurement scandals, a health sector for example, then logically part of the public finance management reforms should focus explicitly on that sector and try to correct the problems. So a better contextual analysis, a clear risk mitigation strategy from the very beginning. The monitoring also needs to be tighter. There are some agencies that don't analyze sufficiently how resources are being spent, don't make full use of the reports they receive from their partner governments, don't make full use of the audit reports that are available. So better management needs to be part of it. Then we need to think about how to develop policy dialogue so it achieves this forward-thinking strategic focus that I'm talking about. Part of that is about separating auditing, as I've described it, from dialogue. Part of it is about situating the dialogue within a wider context. So, for example, we noticed that in Morocco, Tunisia, the association agreement with the European Union helped the dialogue process in those countries. It made it part of a wider discussion about trade, development, growth. To the extent that one can situate budget support in a wider context, that will help. One also needs to have more of a focus. You can't have a forward-looking dialogue if you're trying to have a discussion about 12, 14, 15 sectors. We think it should be somewhere like 8 sectors. Detailed attention, proper analysis, proper dialogue. Linked to that, the next recommendation is about technical assistance and capacity development. This is the underused component of budget support. In some cases it worked quite well. We saw there was good support to audit institutions, to public finance management, to revenue agencies. But there were other parts of government where it could have been used and it wasn't. So I've spoken about the difficulties in addressing the real problems of growth, addressing the problems of the agriculture sector, energy, infrastructure. There wasn't very much capacity development in those sectors. So using capacity development in conjunction with policy dialogue as a way of supporting an integrated approach. And using capacity development in a much more imaginative way. Many of the countries involved here didn't really want this capacity development because they thought it would involve an advisor sitting in an office next to the minister, and they didn't feel they needed advisors. But if it had been presented to them as a mix of things, as the potential for twinning between institutions, a potential for exchange visits to examine policies which are similar in Europe or in other countries, if it could be a mix of processes to build capacity, that would work better and it would give sort of the third leg of the budget support process much more force. And then finally, we need to improve just the basic harmonization of processes. They need to be made simpler, They need to be able to work in a way which reduces transaction costs and doesn't generate great long reports and hide the real strategic because there's so much attention to detail.